Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the McCollum Show, a podcast by Human Reaction. Today, I'm talking with Jeffery Degner about his new book, Inflation and the Family, and how the Federal Reserve, through its monetary policy of inflation or money printing, has destroyed American culture and the family unit. If you enjoy this episode, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And thank you all who have subscribed to me over the past few episodes. I cannot be more grateful at the growth that this podcast has had. So please also remember to check out my friends at Human Reaction. They're the weekly commentary podcast that I partner with. My friends Joe Sheehan, Kyle Mack, and David Rand put out almost weekly podcasts on culture, commentary, and news. It's really good stuff. So I'll make sure to have the link to their podcast in my description, but also check out our Discord. I'll have the link to join our Discord where you can follow up on podcasts or share news and share social media posts and memes and stuff like that. And then also you can recommend questions and stuff for my interviews. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy this interview with Jeffery Degner.
Liam McCollum, really one of the brightest young minds in the Liberty Movement, one of our rising stars.
All right, thank you so much, Jeffery Degner, for joining me today. I think the first time we met was in 2023 at Mises University, and we were discussing Guido Holzman's Ethics of Money Production. I actually have a copy of it right here.
Great.
I'm a big fan of this book, and so much so that I actually gave a copy of it to Jordan Peterson.
I remember that story. Yeah, that was great to hear. And so that's one of those interviews that I would love to see happen. And even on X this last week or so, Jonathan Newman from the Mises Institute had a picture of Guido alongside Tucker Carlson and encouraging us, hey, let's make this happen, because this issue of starting really with the ethics of money production, what a great title. That really kicks us off. And I think for me was the origin story of the book that I've now released here this last June.
And the reason I find it so significant is because, you know, economics, I think when most people think of it, especially younger people my age, they tend to think of it as like this science, this technical thing that's separate from everything else in society. It's in its own silo and maybe has something to do with Wall Street, GDP, and they don't really GDP, something like that, some numbers, some charts, and you know, they don't really understand the consequences of economic decisions. And I think the beauty of Austrian economics is that it is the causal realist school. It tries to explain, you know, how economic policies have certain causes and certain effects in society. And the reason ethics of money production is so significant is that it talks about the cultural effects of inflation. And in your book, I think is a necessary follow-up to it, zeroing in on the effects of inflation on the family unit.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you bringing that connection, because it was a book for me that was very important. And it was really the second or maybe third book I read in sort of the Austrian canon. And I'm still a little bit of gray here, but I'm a little bit of a late bloomer. I was an undergrad at a state university. I studied economics and history, and never once in that undergrad experience were even the Chicago school economists even mentioned, let alone the Austrians. And so eventually I got a job as a high school history and economics teacher. But by that time, you know, life was rolling. I was married, had a couple kids, coaching high school football. You're just busy with life. And I was invited to a teachers conference at Hillsdale College, where for the first time, Mises' name was mentioned to me, and the folks there began to describe some of his viewpoints, and it began to immediately answer the problems that I was seeing with the Keynesian system, but hadn't dug into. So now, at that time, I was in my master's program in economics, and so by the time it was all over, I got both a diploma in education, on the one hand, but a real learning experience, a self-teaching experience in the Austrian school, and thanks to the great resources at the Mises Institute. So as I mentioned, Ethics of Money Production was one of the first ones that I read. We were we were not highly paid at this district. So what I did, instead of ordering the book through the Mises bookstore, of course, the free PDFs are online. So I was in my classroom one day, and it was a lunch break, and I said, you know what? I started reading this on PDF, but man, I got to take this home. I got to read this. So I printed out the whole thing and got a scolding from the teacher down the hall about using too much printer paper. But I still have it I got a little file over here. I still have this printed PDF version of Ethics of Money Production. And thankfully we're doing a little better. I've got an actual copy these days. But there is a line there, and you've alluded to it already, where Professor Holzman says that fiat currency is a juggernaut of spiritual, economic, and social destruction. And that rang with me. There's a footnote where he describes fiat currency as a diabolical sort of thing. And I think that, again, that's what this book that has come out here this past June is really reflecting on, especially as it applies to the family. And so that's kind of the story of what put a little fire in the belly for me to pursue this topic. But little did I know in 2011 that 8 years later, I would have the blessing of becoming one of Guido's doctoral students. That was completely unforeseen, but has been an incredible blessing, encouragement in my life. And if there's anything I can say about the experience of being in his PhD cohort, you learn the economics, and we are drilled, and we are not let off the hook at any point. But I really learned most of all from him how to be a scholar and a gentleman. Those two things are the most outstanding things. And so when you see a person of high moral character produce such high quality scholarship, that's a person to pay attention to and be mentored by. And so it's been a real privilege to go on this process, to taking that theme, that idea, and applying it to family life and the erosion, really the deinstitutionalization of family life that we have seen in America, that a lot of people have taken a stab at trying to explain. And this book is not meant to jettison those explanations. It's just that the connection between inflationary policy, inflationary culture, and family destruction is something that no one has given attention to. And so that's what this whole project is about.
Yeah, and as you alluded to right there, there are many theories as to why the family unit has been destroyed over the last 100 years. And many conservatives have pointed out it's the welfare state, or, Pat Buchanan pointed to birth control and feminism in the United States, or, maybe philosophical or religious issues like Malthusianism or atheism. But I think your book really introduces, in addition to those theories, not as an alternative to those theories, that inflation really is undergirding the economic status of the family unit, and why many young people aren't getting married and having children. So I guess to kind of talk about those cultural effects, why don't we kind of like ground this and talk about the state and the health of the family unit in the United States? I found this recent chart on Twitter that we were talking about before we hit record, talking about the estimate, the percentage of 30-year-olds who are both married and homeowners in the United States. So, why don't you just set the scene? Like, what is the problem that you are identifying?
Well, the problem here is home prices, plain and simple. And if we look at the over 50% back in the 1950s, we see a little bit of a break there in an important phase, as we both know and understand, the early 1970s, where our monetary system officially comes unhooked from the gold standard. We start to see a pretty steep decline there in the 70s. But then again in the 90s with the Greenspan put, where much of the inflation that was created in our central banking system, both the central bank and the commercial banks, and we can get into the mechanics of it all a little bit later, but the clear point here is that we have seen a significant increase in inflation-adjusted terms, even for rising house prices over time. And so this is the core of that story that we see on that graph. And so there are a number of other things to think about, but I think for starters, the way in which, especially post 2008, where you remember politicians like John McCain coming out and demanding that the Fed does whatever they can to prop up home prices. Well, prop up doesn't just mean maintain. That's code for prop up and continue to increase. And so with that expectation set for young people that the price of homes, even starter homes or your median price, which is now around $400,000 in the United States, there is no expectation that those prices are going to begin to come down. So if you're a young person, even if married, you're probably renting these days, or single, that would certainly be the case, renting with roommates, etc. Cohabitation is one of the issues I address in the book, that this has been normalized both on a moral and legal sort of standing, but it's also very unstable. And cohabiting couples are very unlikely to form marriages. It's a very unstable relationship, and those typically do not grow into the kind of relationship where you're truly going to merge finances, build a down payment, and move into the housing market. And so the inflationary house market is where I would point to begin explaining that graph.
Another stat that I found recently, I believe it was from Credit Karma, was that 49% of people in Gen Z don't even find it worthwhile to save for the future.
Yeah.
And I recently saw this video that I wanted to play for you of Dean Withers, who is like this young leftist 20-year-old streamer talking about inflation. And there seems to be a serious misunderstanding of what inflation is among the young generation. So I wanted to share that clip really quick.
Is the only reason that prices go up is due to inflation? Is that the only reason that prices will go up? Yes or no?
Inflation is defined as prices going up.
But I'm asking you, is that the only reason? I know what the inflation definition is. Well, is that the only reason?
It's not that it's due to inflation, it's that it is inflation.
Lord have mercy. I know, I get it. Is that the only reason that prices of gas and groceries will go up?
Wait.
Is because of inflation. Here, hold on.
A few moments later.
Wait. I want you to define the term inflation.
Dude, stop.
No.
12 seconds later.
Well, it's the general level of prices for goods and services rises, reducing the purchasing power of money over time.
Thank you. So you just defined inflation as rising prices.
Okay.
Bingo.
So I don't think you're getting this.
I don't think you're getting this. You just said, is the only reason for rising prices? You get that?
No, you're not. Hear me out. Hold on.
Walt, please just hear me out, please.
So there you see a lot of confusion about the term, two definitions being proposed. So I'm wondering, before we go on, how do you define inflation? What is the problem here? And maybe in this definition, could you explain what Cantillon effects are? What exactly is happening with the Federal Reserve? Because, when I first discovered the Federal Reserve, when I first read about the Fed, I remember vividly learning about the difference between warehouse banking and fractional reserve banking, and then learning that the Federal Reserve is printing money and that it's devaluing our currency. And I was surprised that no one had ever mentioned this before. So can we just talk about and define terms here?
So I can see why there's confusion among young people these days. Having taught in the high school ranks and now at the college level, I can reasonably say that economics is one of the worst taught subjects in American high schools. So on one hand, I can understand the young man's frustration, but indeed, the typical understanding of inflation is the general rise in prices. Well, that raises the question, what prices are we talking about? And specifically, what gets reported on and is always the headline news is the CPI, right? The Consumer Price Index. And that's a politically determined basket of goods and services where the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we've had some events this past week that might call into question some of the statistic accuracy that's happening at the BLS, but setting that aside, they pick a basket of goods and services to measure the overall price increase on a monthly, quarterly, yearly basis. And that's the definition that most people are familiar with. But that ignores some really important factors like other prices in the economy. You can think of what economists call intermediate goods, right? These are the things that we use to make stuff. The wholesale price index, this isn't given quite the attention that the consumer price index is. So there's that price-specific focus that most people think of when they think of inflation. Now, in the Austrian tradition of Ludwig von Mises and his students, we view inflation as money supply expansion beyond reserves. Plain and simple. And so in that way, there's really no mystery. If we have money supply expansion beyond the reserves, that's a cut and dried, easy to understand sort of measurement. Whereas the CPI is more of a politically created measurement that has been changed from time to time. And wouldn't you guess it, it's usually to make the regime look a little better as sort of directing the economy in a way that's not so bad, right? And this is the distinction that we really want to make. So if that's our definition of inflation as Austrians, then there are some knock-on effects, right? There are some consequences for this new money expansion. And one of the earliest descriptions of this comes from a guy by the name of Richard Cantillon, and that's where we get this term Cantillon Effects. Now, to get to the real short version of it, a Cantillon effect is a situation that arises with new money creation where the first recipients are beneficiaries of the new money expansion and the later recipients are harmed by the new money expansion. Now, this looks very practical, and Cantillon himself, in his essay on economic theory, which is available for free at the Mises Institute on a PDF. It was edited by Mark Thornton. In the book, in section 2, chapter 6, he goes through a very nice household level description of what this process looks like as it unfolds. So he talks about early recipients of the new money creation being able to bid on goods and services that they weren't able to bid on before, but the prices are what they are. They haven't begun to rise until these folks begin to place higher bids. And he talks very specifically. He says that these households are able to purchase fine linens instead of wool. They're able to purchase nicer wines instead of beer, and talk about the improvements to the specific households of the recipients of this new money. Well, Cantillon unfolds this story, and we see that those folks who are farther down the line of expenditures are those folks who are left with higher prices that have been bid up by those first recipients, but they themselves have not seen any wage growth. So they might be on fixed incomes of some sort, salaried positions where they don't see pay increases, and they are left to deal with this higher price regime for goods and services. Now, that is kind of a long way to illustrate the Cantillon effect, where again, the first recipients of new money are the beneficiaries, the late recipients of the new money are harmed.
Now, I think when most people think about banking, they would assume that when they deposit their money in the bank, that it's there. So people would be surprised to hear that money is actually being loaned out, that money is being created at their bank. So could we talk a little bit about the mechanism and how money is created?
Sure. So here we're going to talk about fractional reserve banking, because that is the mechanism through which new money is created. So essentially, if you go ahead and deposit a paycheck for $1,000 at your local banking institution, and the bank is required by the central bank, in our case, the Federal Reserve, let's say that they require a 10% reserve ratio. Well, what that means is that the bank needs to hold 10% of your $1,000, $100, need to hold it in the vault. And I use air quotes there because most of our transactions are done digitally, but they need to keep it on their balance sheet. Now, what that 10% reserve ratio allows them to do is to lend out the remaining $900. And of course, they lend it out at interest to other parties, whether it's someone looking for a home loan or maybe a small business owner looking for a business loan. So in this way, we've got new money brought into the economy because you have your $1,000 deposit, but that second customer who comes along for a loan is now issued $900 in new credit based on your deposits, and then they take it and deposit it into another institution, maybe to purchase a home or buy some real estate for a business, what have you. But in that very first step, we see a rapid increase in the total money supply. And so that's the basic version of what happens and how money gets created in the banking system. Now, we often use expressions like, the Fed prints money. Well, yes, there's some technical truth there, but really the banks themselves that are under the cover that are under the not so well, you could say the not so watchful eye, but we do have these Fed regulators. But in any case, they are in charge of setting the rules for banks and their lending practices. And so when the Federal Reserve lowers that reserve ratio, is something they've done historically, then this allows for new money creation by those banks. And so that is the quick and dirty version of what happens in the banking system to cause money supplies to expand. And then once this happens and continues to happen, right, it's not as though this is a one-time process, right? This is happening with every deposit and every person who comes to the bank for a loan for whatever purposes, whether it's consumer loans or for business purposes. This is ongoing. So in Cantillon's story, he's talking about a one-time injection of new money, and the result is what it is. Again, early recipients benefit, late recipients are harmed, and the households of those late recipients, they sometimes take kind of drastic measures, as Cantillon tells this story. He says that they'll uproot their families, they'll maybe move to urban areas where income prospects are better, or they might move to another country where inflation isn't so prevalent. And so, again, I want to connect the theory that Cantillon developed for us to some real life modern day cases like the way we do banking. And it's had some pretty serious consequences for households. And we can talk about how there have been different effects upon households, right? Because again, there is a beneficiary class, and then there are those who are harmed.
So I guess to that point, who are the new recipients? Are the new recipients the people who are taking out loans at banks? And then how does this affect the family unit to tie it into your book?
Yeah, so one of the first recipients of new credit expansion in the system will be the government itself. And so the households who are connected to new government expenditures, think military industrial complex, think of the technical surveillance state. They are the early recipients of new government spending. All right, think in the past administration, the Biden administration, we can think of those green companies, right? They were the first recipients. And often we think, these companies. Well, that's true. These companies are the first recipients of that new money, but it's the households of the people who work at those companies that are getting these big pay boosts and so forth. And Dr. Patrick Newman and I got started on a paper. We've got to get that thing across the finish line that illustrates in Washington, D.C., those politically connected firms that have a lot of lobbyists or that invite a lot of government expenditure to their firms and their industries, they are among the wealthiest households in the country. And this is borne out, and we see it through their bidding power, and particularly their bidding power in the housing markets. The most expensive real estate you can buy in the U.S., by and large, is in the Metro D.C. area. So that's evidence right there that those first recipients are well connected to government, whether, again, through the military-industrial complex, through the kind of the tech bro sort of complex, and others. So that's the first layer of evidence. And it's interesting to see then what happens in the D.C. area. You have this enormous disparity between different zip codes in that area. And you'll see a lot of families struggling to find affordable housing. They, of course, have a bit of a homeless issue in that area because, in part, of these high prices. Now, of course, there are other factors, right? We are not here to say that the only thing driving increasing house prices is the Federal Reserve and its member banks, right? There are other things like zoning. There are other measures that are taken to prevent new housing from being constructed. These things matter as well. But to get all the way down to its final indirect effect, we see families who are beneficiaries, households that are able to sustain very cushy lives in the DC area. And as it turns out, there's a book that was written in 2012 by Charles Murray, and he describes areas like this in the DC metro area. He calls these super zips. These are places where you're seeing enormous bidding power because of the kinds of incomes these people are earning. And you see what he called a new form of segregation, where those folks who are the beneficiaries of Cantillon Effects, they do get married. They do stay married. They have the number of kids that they desire, and they send their kids to every kind of violin lesson, equestrian, they're riding horses, these kinds of expenditures on household life create a situation for those households that's by and large very stable, very traditional, if you will. And Murray points this out in Coming Apart. But what about the later recipients? And that is a lot of what my book addresses, is the deinstitutionalization, or what I, in a couple of spaces, call the liquidation of traditional marriage and family life in much of the middle class and certainly the lower class, as they are those who are harmed by Cantillon Effects.
So in your book, you talk about inflation culture. What are the features of this inflation culture?
So there are many features, and I'm continuing to think about this, but this book was the first attempt to classify the inflation culture and what we mean by that. So there were three areas that I was primarily focused on in the book. The first was rising income inequality, or wealth inequality, and that's coming through very clearly with that Cantillon effect. We've already addressed that a little bit. The other thing is the debt culture. So with ever rising prices, not only for homes, but also for things like higher education, we see a rush into debt. And so the debt culture is the second key category of behaviors, habits, and institutions that are developed in the inflation culture. And then the third is this accentuation of moral hazard. And moral hazard, in a nutshell, is when you or I take risks that we normally wouldn't, because we believe that we have someone to back us up, a bailout mechanism, if you will. And so those are the three sort of general categories that I have in the book. But again, this book got submitted in its final manuscript in December or so, around New Year's, and of course was just released here in May, June. And I'm continuing to think about this and where we can expand, because there are other features. And one of the speeches that was given at the Mises Institute Supporter Summit a couple of years ago was by my professor, Guido Holzman, on the consequences of fiat currency. And he goes into some other details. He talks about rising materialism, a sort of haste and pace in life, where buy now, pay later is quite rational in many respects. And so this inflation man, this person that has their psyche surrounded and fully infiltrated by the realities of ongoing price inflation, the ongoing loss of purchasing power encourages us to live for today and to push off tomorrow. So those are a couple of extras that I continue to think about. And I think there's more to be developed on this about what do we really mean by the inflation culture. And so I'm looking forward to trying to advance that work some more over the next months and years.
So what role do interest rates play in this? Because there's obviously a lot of talk right now with Donald Trump calling on Jerome Powell to lower interest rates. And how does it play into just high time preference? And maybe go ahead and define that.
Yeah. So defining high time preference. So time preference is simply, it's a phrase that we give to acknowledge the reality that as human beings, we would all prefer to have something sooner rather than later. So that is just an acknowledgement that we have a time preference. Now, the question is, to what degree do we prefer things now rather than later? And that's where I'm careful to use the phrase a time preference rate, because someone who has a low time preference rate, that's a person we would say has a character of patience, delayed gratification. They're willing to save a little more. We might call this person a little more frugal, a little more future oriented. That's a person with a low time preference rate. Now, a person with a high time preference rate is that impulsive person. My grandparents would say to me, if I was going through my money that I had earned, they'd say, "Oh, your money's burning a hole in your pocket." That's another way to sort of talk about a high time preference person. Impatient, they won't delay gratification, right? Well, in Austrian economic theory, what we look at first, we always want to look at a situation where the state has not intervened. The state has not come in to suppress or to alter interest rates in any way. Often referred to as the pure time preference theory of interest rates. So the way we would get interest rates is to really just look at the time preference rates of everyone in society. And you and I have different time preference rates, right? Every single person has a little bit of a different degree of desire to get things now, right? Well, if we're to sort of, we're loath to do this sometimes, but to sort of aggregate this, we could measure that as an interest rate, okay? And it would just be an indication of society's willingness to wait for future goods. Now, let's inject the central banking system. Let's inject the Federal Reserve, okay? Well, what they tend to do is to suppress interest rates below that natural or pure rate. Well, lower interest rates would be an indication that we are all behaving in a more impatient sort of way, okay? Well, what happens here is that when the Fed intervenes and suppresses interest rates, it in fact drives that behavior and that impatience, that haste, that we've referred to here in the inflation culture. So we wind up again with a society that's driven more towards consume now or buy now, pay later, a willingness to go into debt to consume things today, and generally create a situation where we have more what's called capital consumption than we would otherwise have, right? So this creates this culture of haste, and accompanied with these lower interest rates is a greater tendency to go into debt faster and in greater amounts and earlier in our lives. And that is precisely what we are seeing unfold in especially in the housing markets. But I think most importantly, and I take some time in the book to describe this, is that the important step of gaining a higher education, and we can debate the merits of higher ed, maybe in another round of discussion here. But if people believe that that's a necessary step in life, and we actually throw a loan at this thing and suppress the interest rate below the market rate for you to fund this, we've seen this unfold. And there's a hypothesis called the Bennett hypothesis that really argued that, look, if we start issuing a lot of student loans, what's going to happen is that's going to drive demand. You have relatively stable supply in higher education. And what's going to happen over time is you're going to see rapid increases in the inflation rate in higher ed markets. And that's precisely what's unfolded since the expansion of the student loan program, right? Well, again, the interest rates on those loans they're like teaser rates. You don't even have to pay them while you're in school, and they're below market rates. And so this induces more people than would otherwise take out money for college to do so. And this has had dramatic impacts on family life. And this is where the book is making the point that the final outcome for families is sort of an indirect effect, right? We've got this credit expansion in the higher ed markets. And so young people are going into debt. Well, if you just ask anecdotally around a college campus, about students and their willingness to get married, one of the first things they'll tell you is, well, I got to get my debt under control before I think about marriage. Well, you've got both young men and young women saying the same thing, and this is contributing, just the student loans are contributing to delays in marriage. Well, that is also unfolding in housing markets as well. And so delayed marriage, that graph that we showed right at the top here, is just one additional example of how suppressed interest rates are driving prices high for higher ed, but also driving prices higher than they would otherwise be for housing. And this is having some serious implications for decisions around marriage specifically. And of course, when it comes to family life, there are other implications as well. We haven't even touched on the implications of this process on fertility choices, or even later down the road, potentially divorce. So that's a lot there. I've been going for a little bit here, but I just do want to illustrate that this book is not saying that young people are glued to their, watching CNBC, waiting to see what Jerome Powell says. And if he says, that there's going to be a quarter point cut in the interest rate, that an engaged couple looks at each other and just says, oh, well, we got to delay the marriage for 2 more years. I don't know what to tell you. But that's not what's happening. But there's these knock-on effects, these second and third order effects of inflationary monetary policy that eventually make their way into our culture, into our habits around institutions that have been around for thousands of years, and they're fundamentally being altered by this persistent inflation.
Yeah, well, it's a simple observation that people respond to incentives. And in short, basically what you have just said is that Federal Reserve policy has created an environment in which people have higher time preference and basically are living in an inflation culture in which they are delaying marriage and delaying child rearing and yep. things like that. And so I guess to get into that, my next question was about this phenomenon that we're seeing where what is it called? It's dual income, no kids, I think is the movement.
Dinks. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So what is the impact on childbirth and fertility?
So picking up really from that last explanation, the first thing that we're seeing is that marriage truly is the driver of fertility. Now, there's a lot of discussion about out of wedlock marriage, and that is a separate but related issue. But let's stick with this marriage delay leading to less fertility. The bottom line is, the later you start in marriage, your window's shrinking. And I hate to sound like somebody's mother-in-law here, but right, the biological clock does tick away. And one of the most powerful examples of this is not in the United States, but actually in Southeast Asia. There, we see significant delays in marriage among, for example, Japanese couples. Now, Japan has long been known as an inflationary regime, and it really does show up in housing prices throughout the islands of that nation. And so notoriously, it's difficult to afford a home there. There's also a cultural element in Japan where to get married, it's an explicit expectation that the young man especially would be able to afford an apartment. And with higher and higher prices, this becomes more and more out of reach, leads to later marriage. And wouldn't you know it, where we see some of the highest real estate prices in the world? In Japan. Where do we see some of the lowest fertility rates in the world? We see it in Japan, and a very similar pattern in South Korea, a similar cultural pattern, a similar inflationary pattern, and we see those delays in marriage. And then the secondary consequence, lower and lower fertility rates below replacement, so much so that governments throughout the world, and of course Japan and South Korea aren't the only places where fertility rates are below replacement, where you're seeing governments get a little nervous because when you don't have future workers, you can't support your pension and welfare systems 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And so they're beginning to issue what are called pro-natalist policies, encouraging young people to get married and have kids, and offer various financial incentives, whether they're tax credits or baby bonuses, all sorts of schemes that have been concocted. But that's where we've come to. And it's my contention, and it was just astonishing to me in the early stages of researching this, really was my dissertation that was turned into this book. It was astonishing to me to read all the economic literature on how housing prices are altering marriage and fertility patterns throughout the world, and nobody was making the connection back to monetary policy and how it drives much of housing price increases throughout the world. So that was where I realized there's a real genuine gap in this literature here, and it's borne itself out throughout the world. Now, we talked earlier about the winners and the losers from inflation. Now, here's an interesting thing. If, and this came from literature in the UK and Wales, if you are a young married couple and you can just get yourself into the housing market, well, you then become a member of that beneficiary class with rising home values. And with additional equity, banks are eager to lend out home equity, and you can maybe make an expansion, maybe add a nursery. And so it was found that with rising home prices in Britain and Wales, that for those homeowners, there's a positive correlation to fertility. But if you're left out of the housing market and you're still a renter, it's got a negative effect, right? So if in the rental class, if you will, with rising home prices, your fertility rates tend to decline because you're stuck in an apartment. You can't blow the walls out, right? The landlord owns the place. And so that was, again, a clear-cut example of how Cantillon effects benefit some who get into the housing market. They see their real wealth increase. They feel a little better. There's sort of an income effect or a wealth effect there, where they do go ahead and have another child. They feel financially secure. Whereas those who are on the outside looking in, they do not feel financially secure. They're looking at an ever more inflationary environment and looking at a fairly bleak future and saying, why or how can I bring kids into this? And so I had just an informal interview with a young colleague by the name of Anna Claire Flowers. She's a PhD student at George Mason, and a wonderful young scholar. And one of the things that she relayed to me was that she's worked in, I believe, a crisis pregnancy center. And so counseling young women away from abortion towards other options. And she had a young woman come to her and say in these words, I would love to have this baby, but with this inflation, I just don't see how it can happen. So something to that effect. And it was just a striking, it's not often that someone will say it that explicitly, but when a young person like this looks at the cost of housing, the cost of childcare, the cost of potentially educating a young child down the road, it becomes overwhelming, discouraging, and steers people away from that process of bringing a new child into the world. So it's a pretty stark example, but I think it does illustrate anecdotally what we see happening in the broader statistics.
And so if you're a conservative and if you identify as pro-life, I mean, inflation really is an issue that I think you should care about. And this is why Ethics of Money Production was so influential on me, is he also approached it in religious terms as well, where he spoke about early church fathers and spoke about the fact that money production was considered to be a sin and considered to be fraudulent, actually. On the level of, the early church fathers considered it just as bad as any other sin.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of examples. And in Ethics of Money Production, Professor Holzman points to Nicholas Oresme as an early author on this. But I've done some study on this myself. And in the Old Testament, you see many, many prohibitions against unequal weights and measures. And for the Old Testament authors, when they thought about money, money was defined as a certain weight, right? So if you begin defrauding others in this process of inflation or debasement, then this is going to have some serious consequences. It's deemed immoral by the God of the Old Testament. No questions asked. In fact, there's language there that says if you even touch unequal weights and measures, you yourself would become unclean. So that's the severity of the sin. And that's why it's often repeated in the Old Testament that unequal weights and measures are an abomination. Like not just a sin, like an oops, I did a bad thing, but a deliberate act of evil towards one's neighbor, right, to benefit oneself. And of course, the kings were notorious for this. And for those of your listeners who are interested in kind of the theological, historical, or biblical case for why inflation is a genuine evil, inflation especially is defined by the Austrians, then key passages are places like Isaiah chapter 1. There's a really important phrase there. The prophet condemns the kings there, and he says that your silver has become full of dross, that's inferior metals, and your wine has become diluted with water. So this describes a process where when the money becomes fraudulent, then the goods and services become fraudulent. And truly, the inversion that happens in society because of inflation is very powerfully illustrated right there. Because if you are an honest dealer, you're an honest merchant, when the money is being debased, you know that you're going to need more of that money to purchase your intermediate goods to sell later. So if you're honest, you'll raise your prices and keep your quality the same. Well, what happens? We see this in our society, right? We see people, particularly on the left, when they see prices rising in this way, who do they point the finger at? Who's the evil one? Well, it's the person, it's the vendor, it's the seller, it's the greedy grocery store owner, right? And they scapegoat the wrong perpetrator, right? So the honest man becomes evil, right? Conversely, the man who is dishonest keeps their prices the same, but takes their wine and pours some water in it. They're deemed to be a hero because they're keeping prices stable. That's the kind of moral inversion that happens in an inflationary environment. So we get all kinds of things mismatched and inverted in an inflation culture. And I think that the biblical examples are really good places to go and see these illustrated. But we see this phenomenon of shrinkflation. That's exactly what Isaiah chapter 1 is talking about. And just like in our time, who gets the blame? The grocery store owner, not the counterfeiter of the money, the one who's debasing the currency. So you have scapegoating, mismatches of relationships, and certainly inversions.
Well said. I'm curious if you looked at all into like elderly care and the fact that, I think other cultures and previously in American history, American families stayed intact even into older ages where families would take care of their parents, would maybe build an extra room for their parents. And that's obviously been delegated, I think, to like old homes and stuff like that. So I'm just wondering if you looked at all into trends like that.
Well, I appreciate the question, and it's an important one. I didn't focus a whole lot on this topic in the book. However, I did touch briefly in a couple cases on the impact of the welfare state. And one of the key components of the welfare state is, of course, Medicare for old age health insurance, but then also the Social Security system. And not going to take a deep dive on that. I'm sure you can tackle that with others at a different time. But what we have seen is that parents historically have thought of their children as a source of lifetime wealth, fellowship, housing opportunities, and even an opportunity to share that wealth into old age, even into their dying moments. Well, that is not so much the case anymore. And there are a few reasons for it. We've already mentioned the ever escalating home prices. It's tough enough for, let's say, middle-aged families. I'm kind of Gen X here, to afford homes for their own situations, let alone an expansion based on construction costs. You might even not live in an area where you're even allowed to make an expansion on your home. And so with this sort of dual problem of the welfare state, where perhaps the generation before us hasn't saved as much as they could have, relying on Social Security as a fallback, right? They may have been a little more reckless in their day-to-day spending than the other guys would have been, right? That's that moral hazard piece. But it's also tougher and tougher for sort of that, well, it's called the sandwich generation, right? It's the generation of folks who are attempting to take care of their parents and don't really have the means to do so, and also get their own kids through, say, college or that sort of thing. So it's really putting a squeeze on kind of those middle generations. So that's a challenge to older folks. And some have said, well, don't feel too bad there, Gen Xer, because you're about to receive the biggest wealth transfer in the history of humankind when boomers pass away and you inherit their wealth. Well, I'm skeptical about these claims because of the massive cost of end-of-life care. And that's not to mention inheritance taxes if you are one of those wealthier ones. Now, not every household is subject to the same amount of inheritance tax, but nonetheless, I'm skeptical about this promise of a massive wealth transfer. We'll see what happens in the next 10 to 15 years as that process unfolds. But this is, again, one of the problems that an inflationary environment creates, right? We've already talked a lot about the housing market, but clearly boomers and Xers like myself, we are the clear beneficiaries of getting into the housing market early. And those younger than us are having a harder time. And just intergenerational conflict and resentment can be one of the social consequences. And so that's nothing to sneeze at, right? That's important in family life. And especially if you come to a point where you've got maybe a couple of siblings or something where they've not done well financially. And this can create additional tension when it comes to inheritance and all this sort of stuff. So inflationary pressures exert benefits to some, but even then, there are additional pressures that come to bear when it comes to dispensing with an inheritance because of the challenges faced by earlier generations. So, I appreciate that question, but it's an important one. Yeah.
So you say that marriage is somewhat of like a luxury good, and I'm wondering what you think of the claim. Before reading your book and reading Holzman's book, I had heard the claim that childlessness is actually a product of prosperity, and that there's sort of this trend, I think, among rich upper class people to be dual income, no kids people. But there's also this idea of third world countries having higher birth rates. So what do you make of the claim that actually in these poorer countries, there's more incentives to have more children?
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes back to the moral hazards around our modern pension systems. So in developing countries, they still view children as a means to prop up overall family wealth. So in a lot of these cases, you'll see that they do not wind up getting the kind of educational investment that we see in the modern West. But we do see children that are relatively young go into the labor force in one way, shape, or form to add to the family overall income. And so that's one of the explanations for relatively higher birth rates in the developing world. However, we are also seeing a relative decline in those birth rates in some of those parts of the world. So it is true that the developing world has higher birth rates than the rest. However, even there, we are seeing birth rate declines. And that speaks a little bit to the importance of ideology, but also the technological development of various contraceptives that the West has imported en masse into the developing world. And so there's a couple things going on there. So even though it is true that we see higher birth rates in other parts of the world, they are still decreasing over time. And so this has led even some of those developing countries to begin looking at some of these pro-natalist policies. And I mentioned baby bonuses and other things.
So I want to get your take a little bit on where you think this country is going politically, because I think this environment is producing a situation where, populist economics is going to take root, especially with young Americans on both the left and the right. So we have Mamdani in New York, being elected in the Democratic primary. And you have Tucker Carlson and people like Steve Bannon advocating for populist economics on the right. And I actually want to play a video of Tucker at Turning Point that kind of gets at this signal, because before I play it, I think there's a situation here where a lot of what they're diagnosing is similar to what we would recognize. And Tucker, in this clip, he talks about economists who focus way too much on GDP. And I think we have similar criticism. So we're almost talking about the same thing. And I think there is an opportunity for libertarians and Austrian economists to come in and actually fill the void for this kind of populist movement. So here's this clip with Tucker.
The basic economics really matter, and they matter because not that it's bad that rich people are getting richer, it's bad that everyone else is getting poorer. And it's especially bad that young people can't afford homes. Let me just put a very precise point on this. If you want a measure of how your economy is doing, I personally favor eliminating GDP as a measure. I don't even know what that is. It's clearly not relevant. They tell me Japan has a stagnant GDP. Have you been to Tokyo? It's the single most radicalizing experience you'll ever have because it's just so nice. You lost the war? Really? Can we lose a war and wind up like this? GDP. No. I don't know what even that is, the total economic activity. Oh, no. My measure is really simple. I got a bunch of kids. Can they afford houses with full-time jobs at like 27, 28? And the answer is no way. And the answer is that 35-year-olds with really good jobs can't afford a house unless they stretch and go deep into debt. And I just think that's a total disaster. That's a complete disaster. Why? Two reasons. One, if people don't own things, they don't feel ownership of the country they're in. And the country gets super volatile because people feel like they've got nothing to lose. When you have a lawn, trust me, you're thinking long term. Second, it's really hard to have a family without a house. It is. It's like super fun to live in an apartment if, there's like a bar downstairs, you're in a cool neighborhood. I'm in East Village. It's so cool. Try to have 3 kids. You're not going to have 3 kids there. You can't. Nobody wants to raise their kids in that neighborhood. Nobody wants to raise their kids in an apartment. People do it because they have to. Nobody wants to. People want a little house, not some McMansion, just a little normal house. That is the actual American dream. And that is what is totally unattainable for young people. And so the only young people in general that you will ever meet who have houses are young people whose parents help them. And God bless their parents. That's a perfectly great thing to do for your kids. But most people's parents can't afford to do that because they're already in debt from their pointless college degree. So that is a national emergency. One of the reasons it's happening is because normal people with normal jobs no longer believe they can win in this system and that all the money is going to the worst people. And no one even stops to ask what the hell is going on. What I'm saying is that our leadership class should say something about it and should assign a moral value to it. And if you're getting rich by loaning money to people at incredibly high interest rates, that's something you're going to have to talk to God about. That is not good. That is not virtuous. That's disgusting. And the fact that nobody feels free to say that, nobody feels like you can just say like 30% on a credit card. Why is anybody paying a credit card bill? Because they always say like, if the very rich, if you borrow enough from a bank, you're kind of in charge of the bank because they need you to pay them back. So they're totally happy to negotiate terms with you. But if you borrow a little bit from the bank, they'll just take your house away. So what if people got together and just decided, wait a second, 30% interest is a lot, especially since they're pushing credit cards on kids like crack.
So there's obviously 2 points there. There's the point about the cultural phenomenon and the inflation culture that I think we've talked about. I think he's rightfully recognizing it. And then there's the point about interest rates. So why don't you address both of those?
Well, maybe I'll work backwards here. So he's pretty animated there about 30% interest rates on credit cards. I'm not so concerned about 30% interest rates on credit cards as, say, 3% or these very low interest rates, these suppressed interest rates. And there's a hint there of moralizing by Tucker, right? He talks about money going into the hands of bad people. He's moralizing around, the bankers themselves. And yes, we have talked about the banking system. Yes, that is the way that they generate profits, right? They borrow from the Federal Reserve at a very low rate, the Fed funds rates, and they sell these products that are interest. Okay, got it. Yes, bankers are doing relatively well. Fair enough. But to just kind of moralize about this and not talk about the actual Federal Reserve system, the banking system that we have, I think that he's missing the target here and just kind of wagging his finger here on a moral basis that our leaders need to say something about the badness of this. No, we need to address the Federal Reserve system itself. And there's no mystery that it's an institution I would like to see abolished. I know there's debate sometimes among Austrian scholars, if you could push the button and make it disappear or, do it, reform the system from within. I don't see much hope for reform. But I do like, say, Steve Hanke's idea about a currency board. That's one option. But in any case, that institution, not just because of what it does, not just because of the things that we've described, but I personally, as a Christian, I take it all the way back to the very immoral nature of what's happening at its base. So enough moralizing about the people. Let's identify that system and the Fed. You mentioned reading and the Fed. I think it was the second or third book I read in my journey to Austrian economics and thinking. So that's one thing. The suppressed interest rates are the real issue here. And then there is this cultural piece, though, that I've got some appreciation and some empathy for. He's right. I think if you do not have an ownership society, where's the buy-in? Where's the skin in the game in your community, right? And a rental situation does invite a little bit of that moral hazard, right? Think of Airbnbs that get trashed, or think about rental units that, landlords come back to and the carpet is ruined and there's, smoke stains all over the place when it was supposed to be a no smoking apartment. These kinds of things, right? These are call them risky or reckless behaviors that renters tend to exhibit a little more. Why? Well, because it's on the landlord, right? I'm going to run my AC furnaces, or my AC or my furnace as aggressively as I can because, I don't have to worry about the long-term use of that thing. So ownership changes this, right? So I think that there is an important cultural piece here, but my main concern, and part of it comes from a book. Actually, I've got it here. A book here called Marriage and Civilization. This is an interesting one by William Tucker. And my main concern is particularly for the social consequence of young unmarried men. Because, as Tucker points out in this book, societies that are full of frustrated, young, unmarried men tend towards violence and even tend towards a state of affairs where polygamy becomes normalized and monogamy becomes pushed to the side. Now, that might seem a little bit out of left field, but just stick with me for a second. I believe what we've seen unfold with all these young unmarried men among the lower middle class and the lower class is essentially extra legal polygamy. That's what we have. We have young unmarried men having children, with multiple women, and of course they don't care for them, and this then spurs cries that we've got irresponsible young men, and wow, wouldn't you know it, we need a welfare state to take care of these women and their children, right? So there's an incentive trap there, or what I call an intervention spiral, where I've got an illustration of that in my book as well, where these outcomes that are driven by monetary intervention often result in other fiscal or social interventions, social engineering, like the welfare state. And if we would just strike at the root cause, a lot of these cultural things that we've talked about, I'll take one example here. Birth control, right? If you go back to Margaret Sanger's language, yes, she was a eugenicist. Yes, she believed in certain race superiority, etc. But her arguments were primarily economic. She was talking about young mothers not being able to make ends meet, if I can borrow a more modern phrase. Well, not being able to make ends meet is a translation for lost purchasing power. And so the justification for abortion and other forms of more modern, of course, abortion is an ancient form of birth control or murder, depending on your perspective. But it's that inflationary environment that looks at children as a nuisance, as a barrier to income production in an inflationary environment. So this forms our psyche. This forms the way that we think about the world and the future. And so if children are a nuisance, and I've got to boost my income to pay for my massive debts and service those debts, and I need to be in the workforce, Janet Yellen herself expressed this, right? That abortion is necessary to keep women in the workforce, right? For what purpose, might I ask? It's to fuel, pay for the debt, which covers the inflationary goods and services that Janet Yellen, as the Fed chair, helped to spur forward. So I view the technology, if you will, of various types of birth control as a symptom of inflation culture, because children become an inconvenience, and technology doesn't come from nowhere, right? The Marxists just believe technology is just a given. Well, as Austrians, right, we think about ideas, means, and ends, right? And if the idea is that I would like to pay off my debts, and the means is birth control to prevent children being born into my household so that I can stay at my job longer and earn greater returns or greater revenues, then it's that idea that brings this technology about. And so, yes, does birth control matter? Has birth control had a massive impact on fertility rates? Yes. But where did that technology come from? It came from an idea that is rooted in inflationary environment that, I would say was inaugurated in 1913, if you want to take the U.S. case. And so that's just one example. And that was one thing that I saw in a lot of the other studies, is that, man, these cultural phenomena, I actually think that's rooted in the mindset of a people who know that inflation it's always going to be positive. It's always going to be persistent. And the only things that are getting cheaper are, relatively speaking, in terms of inflation adjusted dollars, is, TV sets, computers, and that sort of thing, consumer goods. So if that's where I'm getting my bang for my buck, guess what? I'm going to consume.
Well, I think that most people, when they think of inflation, they sort of think of it as a law of nature that just goes up regardless. And they kind of have a vague memory of their grandparents telling them that they used to be able to afford burgers for 25 cents or something like that. So I guess my question is this something that has to always happen, or can we end this process? Can we end this cycle and inflation culture?
Yeah, we can end this cycle. It is not inevitable. Inflation is a policy choice. It's not just something that happens in a capitalist industrial economy. It is not, to use a fancy word, it is not endogenous to capitalism or to free markets, right? Inflation is a policy choice. And we know the institution, we know its name, and it's time to be rid of it for the sake of families. And, we off air, we were talking a little bit about some of the joys of family life. You and I met at the Mises Institute in 2023, and my wife and I got to play a key role in a little bit of matchmaking, and to see marriages happen among young people, especially liberty-minded young people at places like MisesU, and it's an incredible joy. I have a very happy marriage, 25 years coming up this December, and marriage and children are a great source of joy in life. I can't put it any other way. And so the ideologies that have degraded and downplayed the importance, the joy, the goodness that come from stable, healthy marriages has done all of us a disservice. And I am teaching at Cornerstone University. It's a great joy to me to see young people here meet and eventually get married. And one of the questions might be, the situation's bad, right? Marriage numbers are down, they're delayed, fertility rates are down. So what do you do? Well, I think the solution is to be wise with your money, yes, but get married relatively young. I know that's very contrary to the advice, but there's something very important about building a life together with a spouse that has similar vision, outlook, religious values, etc., and building something together that over time brings a lot of happiness and joy and contribution to a community. So there's an interesting step here, right? If you want to get into the housing market earlier and be one of the beneficiaries of the inflation, well, one of the best steps to that is to get married, reduce your separate living expenses, and start working wisely together. And so that, to me, is one of the hopeful messages. We've alluded to faith here and biblical teachings, but one of the things that we're called to do is to be as wise as a serpent and innocent as a dove. So do what's right, but also be wise to the situation that you're in, because saving the way that my grandpa did isn't going to cut it anymore. The math just doesn't work anymore. Right, but there are ways to wisely navigate the situation, and getting married first and then having children after that is one of those paths to avoiding the worst degradations of the inflation culture.
So we might as well bring him up because you alluded to MisesU, but my friend Samuel Peterson, you played a large part in introducing him to his new wife. So why don't you tell that story?
Oh, yeah, it's a fun story. And Samuel and I actually connected at least a year earlier, and he had seen a little bit of my work on the Mises Wire and some other places, the QJAE, Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, on an article I wrote that was actually the literature review for the dissertation, became the book. So he reached out, and we had a little back and forth and wanted to do some research together. I pointed him to some resources and so on. And so eventually we met at MisesU, and I got to see Sam at some other events, as he's done very, very well for himself as a young scholar, winning some awards at the Mises Institute. So had a little bit of familiarity with Sam over at Grove City College. Now, in the meantime, I'm here in Grand Rapids, Michigan at Cornerstone University, where we're building really an explicitly Austrian program, and have actively been recruiting students to go to MisesU. And so in the run-up to MisesU 2023, we had a very large contingent, the largest contingent in the country, I might add, from little Cornerstone University, and we brought 9 students. 8 of them were young women, which is also a little bit unusual in terms of the ratios of males to females at MisesU.
Very true.
And one of the young ladies, Annika Van Bolhuis, now Annika Peterson, was able to join us on that trip. And it was just a treat to encourage them. Sam inquired of me about Annika, and my wife happily was along as a chaperone as well. And so she encouraged Annika, and along with a dear friend at the Mises staff member, Felicia Jones, we kind of conspired a little bit and encouraged Samuel to grab a coffee with Annika. And I want to say that was Wednesday, and things moved pretty quickly from there. And they were happily joined in marriage this last May, and it was a real joy to be there. But again, here's an example of a young couple with similar values, and they could talk about that on their own. I don't need to dive into that, but I think they're set for a very long, happy life together, and it's just it's a great thing to see. So, if you're looking for love in all the wrong places, you need to come to MisesU and find other liberty lovers like yourself. And
you just wrapped up at MisesU. It was 2 weeks ago, right? 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, why don't you explain what MisesU is? And, I've been, I believe 4 times in total, and I couldn't go this year. I'm hoping to go my last time next year because it's only for students. Well, I guess you can, if you're not a student, you can still go, but you can get a scholarship if you're a student. And I highly recommend it to any young person who's interested in the topics we've discussed here and in Austrian economics or libertarianism or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, MisesU, as the name would suggest, is held at the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, typically in late July, and held annually. And it is, as the catchphrase goes, it is the best week of the year. And I believe it is. It's a wonderful time to meet with other scholars, but also meet with students from around the world. I mean, we have a global presence there at MisesU, and it is a week-long intensive exploration of Austrian economics, really covering the basics all the way up to applied topics. And we have just a wonderful array of economic issues that are discussed. For example, Dr. Timothy Terrell, he'll talk about environmental economics and higher ed, the economics surrounding that area. We have Dr. Sean Rittenauer traditionally gives a talk on stages of production and the division of labor, among others. This year we have some of our European scholars. David Howden, who was a wonderful editor on my book, gave a few talks on money and banking. Carl Friedrich Israel gave some talks on the cultural consequences of inflation. So a topic near and dear to my heart, but of course, other scholars there as well. And one of the longtime scholars, Dr. David Gordon, always gives that talk on praxeology. And one of the really amazing developments here at Cornerstone, we're again trying to put ourselves on the map as an explicitly Austrian economics program, sort of a free enterprise school of business. David Gordon, his library needed to be moved out of his home for structural reasons, if that gives you any clue to the size of his library. And a portion of that library is coming here to Cornerstone University, about approximately 4,000 volumes or so. And the volumes that we're receiving are those centered on economics, history, theology even. So David was very widely read, and of course some works on philosophy as well. So that a portion of his library will be housed at Cornerstone going forward. And so
That's incredible.
Our connection here at Cornerstone to the Mises Institute is growing in depth, and I couldn't be more pleased. So if you're looking to study Austrian economics, I know we've got some great names, Grove City is a great place to go, but we're building something here too. And I love my guys there, Sean, Jeff, and Caleb. They're wonderful scholars. And I'll be having the opportunity to go to Grove City this February and delivering one of the keynote speeches at their Austrian Student Scholars Conference. And I'm really honored to have received that opportunity. And that was one of the quickest yeses that I've ever given on a commitment, but happy to be doing that. And truly our friends at Grove City, they're just partners in this work. And we're trying to make some inroads where Austrian economics has been pushed to the margins. There are some outposts, not just at Cornerstone and Grove City, but you're familiar with our other great colleagues at our universities across the country. So we'll try and keep up the good work.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. Why don't you tell people where they can find your stuff and especially your book?
Yeah, so my book, you can find it on Amazon, and I will tell you up front, it is a academic publisher, and it's targeted for academic audiences, so it's on the pricey side. However, my publisher has allowed me to send a PDF to those who are willing to provide reviews for it, so I'm happy to do that. And so you can find that book on Amazon. I am newly back on Twitter. I'm not as talented as some of you folks. I mean, the things that you fire off there, Liam, and some of our other dear friends at the Mises Institute, I'm it's not my forte, but I'm there. So you can find me simply at Dr. Jeff Degner on Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm a little more active there, just kind of touting the work that's going on here at Cornerstone, as well as things at the Mises Institute. So you can find me in those places. And my email, you can find that on the Cornerstone website as well. So that's where you find me, and happy to interact on any of these topics.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks, Liam. Appreciate the work you're doing, and we'll soldier on. We appreciate you. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into the Liam McCollum Show, a podcast by Human Reaction. Check out the Human Reaction weekly podcast hosted by Joe Sheehan, David Rand, and Kyle Mack, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to both of our channels.